Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the third lecture in our fall Luis Martín lecture series in the Humanities, which is titled The Alhambra and Beyond, Tracing Spain's Islamic Legacy. As we are inviting Cristina Aldrich back to the podium, I won't go into an introduction. We're just thrilled to have her back for the second lecture that she is giving in this series. So welcome, Cristina.
Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you all for being here on this dreary Friday right after Halloween. It's great to see you for the third week. And I just would like to recap before I begin today's lecture and say that in the first lecture, we took really a broad look at the exhibition upstairs by exploring the 19th century fascination with al-Andalus, which is Spain's medieval Islamic past. We discussed how this interest was captured through the eyes of artists and authors, each interpreting this Islamic heritage in unique ways. So we examined the works of Genaro Pérez Villamil, so this print here, Washington Irving, Mariano Fortuny, Owen Jones, here with the Grammar of Ornament, and Joaquín Domínguez Becker as well, all of whom contributed to constructing an image of al-Andalus that resonated with both Spanish and international audiences of their time. And then last week, Professor Asgar Alibhai offered an exploration of the artistic legacy featured in the exhibition, centering his discussion on this single object, so the capital from Medina al-Zahra. He really illuminated the Umayyad artistic traditions that flourished in medieval Spain, tracing their roots back to early Umayyad art in Damascus. He explained how later dynasties on the Iberian Peninsula, including the Almohads, the Almoravids, and the Nasrids, visually referenced and reinterpreted these Umayyad traditions, really drawing inspiration from what they viewed as the most powerful symbols and styles of Islamic rule. Now, today we're returning to the 19th century, but with a specific focus on the medium of photography. Many of the works in this exhibition are photographs on loan from De Goyer Library here at SMU, which houses an extraordinary collection of photographs of Spain and Malta, along with an impressive archive of stereographs, which you can see upstairs. These images really help show how Spain's architecture was captured, preserved, and to some extent reinvented through the technology of photography. And in this lecture, I'd like to explore the rise of photography in Spain during the second half of the 19th century, a time when Córdoba, Seville, and Granada became central in shaping and exporting the image of Spain to the rest of the world. This was also a period marked by the rapid rise of international tourism, particularly from Great Britain, France, and the United States. For example, on the screen here, you can see an important publication, Richard Ford's Handbook for Travelers in Spain, as well as Washington Irving's Tales of the Alhambra, which we discussed in the first week. Thanks to advances in transportation and new train systems, new train routes, tourists arrived really eager to experience what they considered to be the exotic remnants of Islamic Spain, and photography played a crucial role in both meeting and really fueling that demand. And photography also allowed tourists to carry home images of what they saw and even shaped what they expected to see, as we discussed 2 weeks ago. Images that captured not only architectural beauty, but also a really idealized, romanticized vision of Spain's past. And I'll note that these photographers listed here are the photographers featured in the exhibition, with the exception here of Charles Clifford. So we'll look at how the work of these pioneering photographers helped shape global perceptions And we'll also consider the questions that arise from this phenomenon, like what image of Spain were these photographers creating, and how did restoration efforts, which were sometimes controversial, interact with the photographic record to craft a very specific vision of al-Andalus? And how did this growing international fascination impact both Spain's cultural self-perception and its position on the global stage? So we'll start here with some of the early photographers and techniques. And we return, of course, to the Alhambra. So this image of the Court of the Lions at the Alhambra is part of Daguerrean Excursions, which was an ambitious publication by the French Noël-Marie Peymal-Lebours. It was published in the 1840s, and it presented the public with these incredible views from around the world, including this scene from Granada. At first glance, it may seem counterintuitive to create prints from photographs. So you'll see this is an etching, but it's from a daguerreotype. So early daguerreotypes, while groundbreaking, produced only one unique image with no option for reproduction. So to share these views with a broader audience, the daguerreotypes were meticulously transformed into engravings or lithographs for publications like this one. And you'll notice the sort of foliage here and the date of 1840s. Now we're going to take a look at some photographs of the 1840s of the Court of the Lions. This was not there. But you can probably tell from these other images here of the Parthenon and of this bridge in Paris that you can kind of picture that this really did come from a photograph. It is very photograph-like in its quality, but they are etchings. Now, I'll pause here for a second to say I'm not going to delve deeply into the entire history of photography in Spain or focus on every technological advancement of the 19th century. Not that these are unimportant, but the primary focus here is on the content of the photographs and what they are depicting. So that said, I'll just highlight a couple of sort of key terms and processes that are important for understanding the works in the exhibition. And the first, as I mentioned, is the daguerreotype. So it's an early form of photography developed by French inventor Louis Daguerre in 1839. The process produced highly detailed, unique images on a silver-coated copper plate and was the first widely available photographic method. Now, albumen silver prints, and you'll see the date on here, it's 1854. So these are both considered really early photographs of the Alhambra. The albumen silver print became a widely used type of print from the 1850s to the 1890s, so a much longer life. The process was the first commercially viable way to produce high-quality photographic prints on paper, and they were valued for the rich detail, tonal range, and I'll note that most of the photographs in the exhibition are albumen prints, and that really shaped the look and feel of photography during these later decades of the 19th century. Later, we will look at stereographs as well. But we have, once again, the Alhambra. And it really served as what one writer described as an inexhaustible resource for both photographers and tourists, which grew into an icon that came to represent Spain's unique cultural identity, and the Court of the Lions specifically. So the earliest photographs dating from the 1840s reveal a shift in how the monument was perceived, really both within Spain and internationally. These first images produced by traveling photographers like Théophile Gautier here were groundbreaking. They captured details often overlooked in earlier engravings and prints, which tended to exaggerate or stylize the monument. So photography offered a sense of scale and realism that, of course, sketches could not. And really, sometimes the difference was shocking to travelers. This is not necessarily the best example to show contrast, but you can see how artists like David Roberts really sort of embellished the space, invented a little bit. And there are even prints that show the Court of the Lions as if it were the size of a football field, just absolutely massive and perfectly square and pristine. So when people saw photographs, they were really shocked. And now Charles Clifford. So we're going to focus on two photographs taken by the artist. He was incredibly influential. He was an English photographer who arrived in Madrid in 1852. So again, this is early, and quickly became one of Spain's most significant early photographers. He was appointed as the official court photographer for Queen Isabel II, and he was granted unique access to document Spanish landmarks, royal events, daily life, and his position really allowed him to really capture cultural moments and spaces, which contributed towards creating a really rich visual archive of Spain during this time. His output was tremendous. Now, his work in the Alhambra, particularly in the Court of the Lions, also helped cement the space as an emblem of Spain's Islamic past because they were so often reproduced. They were put in prints, they were sold as photographs and albums. He, like I mentioned, very prolific, and he often included scenes like this in his albums of Granada. Now, I'll also mention that aside from capturing cultural scenes, Clifford's photographs had a documentary function as well. They traced transformation in Spain's urban landscape. So from Madrid's Puerta del Sol, which you see here, very different than what it looks like today, to industrial developments like railways and construction projects like you see here. And it was really through Clifford's lens that we glimpsed the tension between this preservation of heritage and the country's really moving forward industrial progress, which is an aspect that adds depth to his legacy because he really is remembered more for capturing these scenes rather than the sort of industrialization of Spain. Now, we also have John Singer Sargent, who many of you are probably familiar with. Sargent, images of Sargent from the late 19th century painting in the Court of the Lions. And this really highlights how the Nasrid Palace served as an inspiration for painters as well. So as we saw in week one, the Alhambra held a special place in the imagination of painters, offering a poetic, transformative space where artists could construct new narratives and really experiment creatively. But Sargent was really deeply influenced by his contemporaries like Mariano Fortuny, who we saw in week one. And he would later incorporate the architecture, atmosphere, and decorative motifs of the Alhambra in his work, really looking to Fortuny for inspiration. He saw Fortuny's work definitely when he was in London and Paris. And I think you can see a sort of nod to Fortuny in some of his paintings. Unfortunately, I don't have this view, but I believe this was in the recent Sargent exhibition at the National Gallery in DC. It was about 2 years ago. They have a beautiful view of the Court of the Lions. And I should note as well that Sargent accumulated a significant collection of photographs while he was in Spain, especially of the Alhambra, using them to study the intricate Islamic designs and atmospheric lighting effects. So these images not only enriched his understanding, but were instrumental in later compositions, including a monumental mural project in Boston. I don't know if any of you have seen that at the Boston Public Library. For Sargent, the Alhambra was more than a subject of study. It really was a continual source of innovation and cross-cultural exploration. And you'll see here that these particular albums are located in Boston at the Harvard Art Museums. And you might recall these tile and stucco details kind of remind us of the work of Owen Jones. If we think back to the first week and Grammar of Ornament, and you think how artists are breaking down the Alhambra into bite-sized pieces of design to then take and sort of tesselize it in some of their work. So like Jones, Sargent was captivated by the geometric complexity, the vibrant colors, and the sophisticated patterns of the Alhambra. And for Sargent, these photographs really were not souvenirs, but invaluable references. And they allowed him to study the visual language of the Alhambra and again, incorporate this into his later works. Now we also see another example of a photograph that belonged to Sargent. And this one is one of a collection of over 600 photographs that was donated to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in 1925 by Sargent's sisters. So these photographs are kind of spread in different museum collections. And they really reflect not just his travel interests of architecture, sculpture, but he really wanted to accumulate a sort of corpus of important Spanish works as well. He visited Spain multiple times throughout his career, and he really treasured and studied these photographs carefully. And you can see here the photographer, Emilio Bauxicano, who was based in Seville, and we will kind of shift to his work now. And I should note, how did Sargent really get these photographs? We should really consider the role of commercial photography in the 19th century in Spain. So rather than focusing only on individual artists, we see a rich world of studios emerging to meet the growing demand for images of Spanish landmarks, especially in the cities of Seville, Cordoba, and Granada. So we'll take a short break from the Alhambra and explore one of Seville's most influential commercial photographers here, Emilio Bauxicano. And I'll come back to this photograph, which is in the exhibition. So the Bauxi family really exemplifies the story of 19th century photographers in Spain, tracing their roots to France before becoming a prominent force in Seville's photographic world. 3 generations of the family dominated the field from the mid-19th century all the way through the early 20th century. And that was Julio Bauxi Pero, his son Emilio Bauxicano, and the grandson Julio Bauxi Garcia. So this is the father, senior. He arrived from France in 1839. He quickly established a high-class shop on Seville's Sierpes Street, which for any of you who have been to Seville, you've probably walked through this street. Here's an image of it that Bauxi took in the late 19th century. So he started selling fine arts materials, fashionable French items, and in 1853, he expanded into photography, creating one of Seville's really premier photography studios that catered to the city's elite. And we can see that here in the portraits he took. He was also a pioneer and introduced materials like leptography paper, which was used for high quality prints. And that was brought to Seville by the renowned photographer Jean Laurent in 1866. And we'll see more of Jean Laurent shortly. He also partnered with Antonio Rodriguez Telle in the 1870s. And their business, which was Bauxi y Rodriguez, that you can see here, Bauxi Rodriguez, it really thrived as they attracted prestigious clients, including members of the monarchy. They also documented significant events, family portraits, and even death portraits, which were a custom of the time. And the Bauxis expanded their repertoire to include popular types and architectural views of Seville, almost like postcards. They photographed artworks, catering to art patrons and especially art historians who wanted photographic reproductions of works of art. He also partnered with Clifford, Morse, and Laurent, and they sold reproductions of works like those by Murillo to different publications. They were even included in a very important publication by William Sterling Maxwell, which was the Annals for the Artists of Spain, which was a really significant publication in art historical studies where you could finally look at works of art from not just a print reproduction, but from a photograph. much like the Sargent photo we just saw of the sculpture. Now, Bauschi's photographs, he's primarily known, this is probably one of his most famous images, of dancers and performers, and it really captures the vibrant spirit of Seville's café cantante scene. So a café cantante, or a singing cafe, was a popular type of entertainment venue in the 19th century. They featured live music, flamenco dance, and singing, typically with a raised stage at one end, a bar at the other, and tables in between. They also provided a space where civilian locals and tourists could experience these traditions together. So it was not just reserved for the tourists. And unlike other photographers of his time who focused just on historic monuments, Bauschi really was considered to bring a fresh perspective to the city's modern life. So he documented not just traditional performances, but also contemporary urban scenes, new hotels, street life, social gatherings, and it really catered to a new growing tourism industry. So unlike Jean Laurent, who we'll see later, he wanted to include really images of people and figures along with the monuments to give a little bit of perspective. So the images of locals in traditional dress, everyday activities, and candid moments, it was really these candid moments that give his work this sort of ephemeral quality. Here you can see more flamenco dancers in his studio. He also captured a lot of the bullfighting world, which is a very popular subject for tourists. And then he also captured, of course, Seville's monuments, including the Alcázar. And this one, which is in the exhibition, I think really shows perfectly that ephemeral quality of his work. And if you're able to spend some time in front of this photograph, I think it's one of the more powerful ones. I believe this figure is actually Bauschi himself. I think he had an assistant or set up his camera here. There's an artist here at an easel painting the space. So you think about too that Becker painting of one of the patios of the Alcázar. And you can see that this is what Bauschi wanted to do, was introduce a little bit of life into these images of monuments. I also just want to show some of the changes to this patio in particular. For any of you who have been to the Alcázar, you'll notice this Patio de las Doncellas, which is one of the most iconic spaces, has this central fountain. There's been archaeological work, actually some of it initiated by Becker in the 19th century, that has really transformed the space. But this is the same space, just much, much altered. Now, as we've seen, these photographs, again, were more than artistic souvenirs. They were also critical documents of Seville's history. And his images of the 1892 flood in Seville really show the city in a moment of crisis. And he documented the impact of natural disasters on the urban landscape and on daily life as well. And these photographs provide a visual record of the flood's devastation, really underscores the role of photography in recording events. And he is considered one of Spain's earliest photojournalists as well. So there's a whole series that Bauschi did of the devastation of this flood. A few years prior to that, in 1888, Seville experienced another monumental event, which was the collapse of the Ciborium ceiling in the city's cathedral. So Bauschi's documentation of this tragedy really became also one of his most famous works, showing the destruction of a symbol of the city and really the spiritual heritage of the city. So it's important to note that these images preserved the significance of the event for future generations. It really works as a sort of conservation document. And this also shows how photography served as a tool, again, for preservation and conservation, and a permanent record of moments that really would have otherwise faded from memory completely. And so this is also part of a larger series, which was documented quite a bit in local newspapers and national newspapers as well. And here we see that destruction and then a group of archaeologists. So now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the photographers Bauchy worked with was Jean Laurent, or Juan, also known as Juan Laurent. He's one of the most influential figures in 19th century Spanish photography, and like Charles Clifford, one of the most prolific. He originally was from France and moved to Madrid in his late 20s and transitioned from a successful luxury paper manufacturer to renowned photographer. In 1856, he opened a photography studio in Madrid and quickly gained recognition for his portraits specifically and his architectural photographs. And his skill earned him the title photographer to Her Majesty the Queen under Queen Isabella II. And he did travel with her on several trips to document all of the official events, everywhere she was going. So those are actually preserved in an album. One copy is at the Hispanic Society in New York, but you can find some images digitized online. And his archive really included over 6,000 negatives, which covered city views, traditional costumes, and art collections of the Prado Museum and other institutions. Laurent's firm became the first to photograph these national collections and helped establish his legacy as one of the most important photographers in Spain. And you can see too the sort of difference in approach between Jean Laurent and Emilio Bauchy, where Laurent really wanted to capture the architecturalness of the building, devoid of figures, almost always devoid of figures. And here we see the Great Mosque of Cordoba. And note that it expanded considerably during the Umayyad period, so in the 10th to early 11th century, with 3 significant enlargements of its prayer hall. This image captures the last and largest extension commissioned by the powerful Vizier al-Mansur in 987. In the background, you can see the Gothic screens of the cathedral's tabernacle added to the mosque in the 16th century, and those are visible here. And Laurent first listed this photograph actually a little bit earlier in 1867, in an 1867 sales catalog. And now we're going to shift from Laurent, from his photographic documentation, to a different representation of the Great Mosque of Cordoba by the Scottish etcher Charles Oliver Murray. And this is in the exhibition. Unlike Laurent's photographs, which really capture every detail with exact precision, Murray's etching of the Great Mosque of Cordoba allows for, I think, a slightly broader, more imaginative perspective, or at least that's what I thought until I started finding these postcards of this very exact view of the Mosque of Cordoba. So Murray created a diverse body of work, which included architectural views, seascapes, copies of contemporary artworks, and his depictions of Spanish landmarks suggest that he traveled extensively throughout Spain. However, we don't have dates for these travels, and he lived a very long life. So there are a lot of gaps in knowledge. And I thought, seeing his etchings of copies of Murillo, of the Great Mosque of Cordoba, surely he traveled to Spain. But knowing that Emilio Bauchy and others, for example, were photographing Murillo, distributing images of those paintings and of these views, I'm starting to think that perhaps this etching was maybe copied from a photograph with figures then inserted. Here you can see a nun and a priest walking through this space. This is a photograph from Rafael Garzón. It would be really helpful if I had dates on these. Unfortunately, I don't. But Garzón was not the only one to capture this view. This one is slightly different. These types of views made me believe that this would be a really hard camera shot. But as you can see from this one, it's absolutely possible. And this is yet another sort of angle of this Capilla de Villaviciosa by another photographer. Actually, this one's pretty early, 1865. So you can see how maybe this was in fact not something that Murray completed in situ, but I think more research needs to be done on his life and dates for sure. And I'll just also note that it's in this etching that he presents the view of the Umayyad architecture. Like many other artists of his time, he really wanted to highlight the monumentality of that massive multifoil arch, and then the Christian church sort of subtly appearing in the background, which again reflects the complex history of the site when it was converted to Christian use after King Ferdinand III's conquest of Cordoba in 1236, so in the 13th century. And I think Murray did have a deep interest in showing and emphasizing the layered history of the Mosque Cathedral, which of course he wanted to emphasize, I think, with the figures, but also the presence of the chapel in the background, which really sits in stark contrast, of course, to the Umayyad architecture. So possibly used these as models. We're not sure. But as you can see, it's not an impossible view. And we'll transition now from Murray's detailed etchings to the Spanish photographers Rafael Señán y González and Rafael Garzón, who's pictured here. And this image is in the exhibition as well. And these photographers also brought architecture to a wide commercial audience. So in his image of Cordoba's hypostyle hall, so this area, Señán really captures the intricate forest of arches. And this was a design and a view also that just fascinated tourists. Rafael Garzón, another leading figure in Spanish photography, initially established his reputation with a studio within the Alhambra, offering portraits that immersed visitors in the allure of the Nasrid architecture. And recognizing the demand for photographic souvenirs, he expanded his business to Cordoba and Seville, where his studios offered locals and tourists alike the chance to take home images of the region's different sites. So here we do have the two initially working together in a studio here in the Alhambra. Then we have Rafael Señán starting his own studio in 1901. So a year after this was taken, they stopped working together and parted ways. Here we see another view of the Granada business, where you can see they would have images and sort of poster-sized photographs of all the different views that you could purchase. And then inside, you would have a studio that sort of recreated these spaces of Cordoba and Granada and Seville. So here we have Rafael Garzón and his son in the Cordoba studio. And it still exists today. It's somewhere that you can actually visit. Daniel Garzón is the great-grandson of Rafael Garzón and continues in the family business. I mean, he doesn't take studio photographs here anymore, but he's very active in digitizing Garzón's photographs, which is incredibly valuable. And you can see again here this pattern of catering to tourists and also having this family business passed from father to son, just like with the Bauchis, just like with the Garzóns. And we'll see more of that later. And we return, of course, to the patio of the Lions, or the Court of the Lions, where Señán and Garzón took an incredible amount of group portraits. So during the late 19th century, these group portraits became increasingly popular for tourists and locals alike, even government groups. And the lions themselves, which they symbolize strength and continuity, quickly became an emblem of the Alhambra's unique identity. And these photographers recognized the court's appeal and used it as a setting. So creating images that immortalize both the beauty of the Nasrid Palace and the collective fascination with this past. But note that it's over a period of decades. So from Fortuny's image, which we saw in week 1, which was from the 1870s, here we see this group of musicians, which is a bit later. This is 1904. Here, 1900. So this goes on for quite a long time, actually well into the 20th century. Here you see artistic and literary group, the Board of Governors here. And here is that, unfortunately fuzzy, but Fortuny Madrazo family group portrait from 1870. So this was continually used as a backdrop. And here is an image from the exhibition upstairs. Note that there are dozens and dozens of examples of the changes in the Court of the Lions as well. We talked a little bit last time during the first week about this figure of Rafael Contreras, who was the restorer of the Alhambra for part of the second half of the 19th century. And remember, he was the one who added this basin in the second half of the 19th century, which has since been removed. He also did a lot of scrubbing of the original architectural polychromy. So that's why this looks, most of the Alhambra has been scrubbed of its original color. And then of course, this dome, which is not 14th century, it is not 15th century. This round dome was an invention by Rafael Contreras to make the Alhambra, as he said, look more oriental. So this was not based on any research or archaeology. Many of his interventions were quite controversial, and many of them were also reversed then in the 1950s. So including this fountain basin being removed, this dome being removed. And so these photographs then become such an important part of the record of conservation and restoration changes that the Alhambra has gone through, especially in the 19th century. Now, I just want to note that this is not just a male space, despite what we have seen. Many women had their portraits taken here, and there were also women photographers. And you can see from this lithograph from around 1890, these 2 female photographers here taking a group portrait of men sitting on the lions, which they often did. And again, this is a family business. And we know that Rafael Garzón's wife, for example, ran the Cordoba studio when he was in Granada and Seville. So we know this from family letters, but she is not credited in the photos themselves. They always have either the name Emilio Belchi or Rafael Gal. It's always the male name, but we know that the women were also taking photographs, and there are also many travel accounts by women authors, by visitors who came. And I'll just note this Lady Louisa Tennyson is especially entertaining. So some of these are really, really wonderful accounts of their experiences too. Now we'll see here also a woman sitting at an easel in the Court of the Myrtles. This is one of the stereographs in the exhibition. So I encourage you to look closely upstairs and you can see this tiny little detail of her. And I'll introduce here the other technology that was crucial in distributing the image of Andalusia in the late 19th century, which was through the stereograph. So the 6 stereographs in the exhibition represent the Alhambra and the Alcázar in Seville, and they really exemplify an early form of virtual reality. So stereographs consist of 2 nearly identical images mounted side by side on a stiff card. And sometimes that card is actually curved to get a better view. And when viewed through a stereoscope or a stereoscopic viewer, they merge to create a single 3-dimensional image. And this technology really is rooted in the studies of human binocular vision, which predated commercial photography, really predated photography period, but gained significant traction, of course, with its advent, since you can create these 2 nearly identical photographs. It's much more hard to do that with prints and drawings. So the stereograph was developed by British physicists in the 1830s, and it captured the public's interest primarily in France through the photographer Louis-Jules Dubosc. And then the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London marked the start of what is considered to be a golden age of stereographs, which found favor with Queen Victoria and really the wealthy elite. Now, by the 1850s, commercial companies were producing thousands of views to be sold to tourists as souvenirs. So then they do become very affordable. It's this part of the sort of democratization of photography, with subjects ranging from European monuments to the landscapes of the American West. And really, they allowed armchair travelers to explore these distant lands and architectural views from the comfort of their homes. And then the American physician and photography enthusiast, Oliver Wendell Holmes, popularized a newly designed handheld stereoscope, which that really took it to a broader audience. You used to have to put these in a big kind of clunky machine or go somewhere to view them. So with the advent of the handheld, it really took off. Now, as we move into a series of slides featuring stereoscopes, we encounter the work of Underwood and Underwood, which is an American company that capitalized on the rising interest of these views in the beginning of the 20th century. So you'll see most of these Underwood and Underwood images are actually from around 1902. They go into the 1920s. So they recognize the appeal and the sort of associations with exoticism of the Alhambra's architecture. And they marketed stereoscopic views that presented scenes of the monument with costumed figures, such as individuals in what they called Moorish dress or peasants posed with donkeys, to really invoke this romanticized vision of Spain's Islamic past, which we have been seeing since Washington Irving. So now for almost 70 years. And here you can see that, where these really start to look like early movie sets. And some do consider stereoscopes and stereoscopic this technology to be sort of a precursor of film. It was founded by brothers Elmer and Bert Elias Underwood, and the company was initially based in Baltimore around 1882 and focused on portrait photography before expanding into stereoscopic images. So it wasn't until 1897, after moving to New York City, that Elmer Underwood established a dedicated section for stereoscopes, and then the business really took off. And of course, they would have to send photographers to Spain to take these images, to work with local groups to get these costumes and set up these elaborate scenes. And I wish I had next to this the painting that we saw 2 weeks ago by Fortuny, because you can start to see that there is a direct correlation between these photographs and Orientalist painting. They're really looking at those dramatic scenes to create that sort of this new narrative in the photographs. And it does, especially when you look at it with the 3D viewer, gives you that sense of movement. So they really were successful in part because they were among the first to frame the Alhambra within this fantastical narrative, accessible to viewers worldwide. And again, I think to me, they kind of look like early movie sets. And the images served both as souvenirs for travelers and as visual journeys for those who could only imagine a visit, which really reinforced the Alhambra's position as a symbol of Spain's exotic allure. And we'll see shortly again how this is deeply tied to Orientalist painting. Here's one more view. This is the court of the council chamber here. And they often employed actually young children to be dressed up in these scenes as well. And that leads to really our final section, which is on studio portraits. And as a reminder, as we transition to a series of studio portraits featuring tourists dressed in Arab garb, it's important to acknowledge the complex historical and cultural context that these images reflect and that we discussed 2 weeks ago. And that's Spain's relationship with its nearly 800 years of Muslim rule, which is layered and nuanced and marked by a deep historical connection that was later overshadowed by the expulsions and forced conversions that followed the so-called Reconquista. So in these photographs, we see this history really repackaged and reframed as a distant and sometimes exoticized past, with North Africa and Arab cultures reinterpreted as costumes and backdrops for Western tourists, which is what you see here. These images align with the broader framework of Orientalism as described and defined by Edward Said, where the Orient is cast as mysterious, distant, and fundamentally different from the West. And these characteristics that were really commodified to offer viewers a contained and safe version of this imagined world. So here, photographers like Rafael Garzón, who had his 3 studios, and others capitalized on this demand and offered studio portraits, which were designed to simulate a Moorish court. And here, tourists could dress up in Arab costumes and enact the scenes that were often based on actually familiar Orientalist paintings. And this is, you can see here actually, a sort of blown up and then painted over photograph of the Patio of the Lions. Here is just one example, more with a musket. This is from 1882. So this is a couple decades before these photographs were taken. And you can see how the tourists are encouraged to pose like these Arab guards from the Orientalist paintings, and shown too with hookahs, tea sets, and we'll see more of that soon. So for Garzón, the studio really became both a business and a form of escapism. The elaborate settings that I just mentioned, again, filled with props, like the hookahs, tea sets, and ornate costumes. These scenes really borrowed heavily from this type of painting, the paintings that we've seen, like by Fortuny, but presented visitors with really a sanitized and romanticized Orient, one without any actual Arab or North African people. So the photographs freeze these fantasies, again, in this safe moment, which allowed viewers to kind of try on another identity temporarily without challenging these social boundaries. And I'll point out too the importance again of Seville's monuments like the Giralda, which is ever present in the photographs of this period. I also want to read, the text is in Spanish, I'll read it in English. The sort of way, one of the ways in which Garzón and other photographers advertise their business. So Rafael Garzón is a Hispano-Arabic studio. He states, the street, Córdoba. We speak French, English spoken. And this is really unusual as well for this time. This house has a beautiful Arab-style studio adorned with the finest and most delicate decorations. Mr. Garzón has an Arab-style wardrobe room. A selection of exquisite costumes is available, allowing guests to be photographed next to their beautiful sultana. or reclining while smoking a pipe. In a word, the most beautiful, seductive, and surprising souvenir. Located in the Arab house of Garzón, again in Córdoba, free admission, dark room, postcards, watercolors, photographs of the main cities of Spain and Morocco, film and plate developing, Andalusian mantillas and local types, models, and an array of Córdoba souvenirs, hand-colored views and portraits. We kindly ask travelers to visit this house. So you can see how they were really pushing the content and promoting this type of tourism, which is now happening, dotted all over southern Spain. Here we see one more example of this relationship to sort of mid and late 19th century Orientalist painting. And I should note that the scholar David Sánchez Cano has recently highlighted these dynamics, examining how the imagery and narratives within Garzón's portraits serve as really windows into a broader social and colonial attitudes in the late 19th century. So these photos were not just commercial products, they were also cultural artifacts, and they aligned with Spain's ambivalent self-image as both European and yet tied historically to a Moorish past. And I'll note that because these were images that tourists purchased, many of these have been lost or are in private collections, but there are efforts to really get many of them digitized. And they've kind of become more and more prominent in exhibitions on the Alhambra as well. And I'll just show one more before we look at this. Now, it's worth noting that this 19th century Orientalist vision continues to shape perceptions of Spain today. Studios in Granada still offer these costume portraits to tourists. And I don't know if any of you have been to the Alhambra recently or seen this. I was actually quite surprised. The market appeal of such images where the visitors, play act their own versions of exotic Spain really reveals just how strong a hold these constructs have over the popular imagination. And they really keep the past alive in a way that blends both nostalgia and this commodified fantasy. And I just want to note too, some of the souvenirs that they still produce, which we saw 2 weeks ago, like these wood inlay frames, the taracea frames, and small stucco models of the Alhambra. So these traditions certainly continue. And I would be curious to know if it's primarily Spanish or foreign tourists who are participating in this. And then on a final note, I just want to explore the fascinating figure of Mariano Fernández, who's widely known as El Príncipe de los Gitanos, or Prince of the Gypsies, and more famously as Chorro Humo, which comes from chorro de humo, like a plume of smoke. Now, he became an iconic figure within Granada's cultural landscape, and you can see that he often posed in these studios. And he really offered his persona as a bridge between local heritage and the fascination of visiting artists, tourists, photographers. So it's really through these portraits that we can see how local identity and personal storytelling really blended with the market for exoticized representations and creating really lasting images of what almost became a sort of mascot or caricature of the Alhambra. I mean, the amount of images I'm curious to hear from all of you. This is kind of a work in progress part of my research, but it's been fascinating to see him pop up time and time again. And for those who often or not so often browse eBay, you can find photographs of Mariano Fernández still, and some of them actually quite expensive. But you can see sort of how the portrait evolves over time and how obviously these cannot be the same person. This is a young man in 1902, this is supposed to be Mariano Fernandez in 1880. So it kind of then becomes more than just about this, this character. So who was he exactly? And I'll note that this photograph is actually here at SMU in De Goyer's collection, and I wish it was in the exhibition, but no matter. So who was he? He became really an iconic model for artists, most notably Mariano Fortuny, who immortalized him in several works. He then leveraged his fame referencing his role as Fortuny's model. So he's always labeled here as Prince of the Gypsies and Fortuny's model. To promote, and he really promoted himself as an Alhambra guide. He offered rich, embellished stories to visitors. He was also Sargent's guide when Sargent was at the Alhambra. So that's why Sargent painted him here, and became widely recognized. And he really then became someone who embodied those romanticized and exotic images of Granada that fascinated both artists and tourists. So again, I'm curious if anyone has encountered this figure. Please, let's talk after the lecture. And just like last time, I wanted to share some of the accessible titles, especially well, these are in English and Spanish, that deal with this topic. And you can also always email me with questions if you have further questions. But I'll note that these are all relatively recent. Charles Clifford and Jean Laurent, a lot of these Spanish photographers, Emilio Bauchy, were really not recognized in the history of 19th century photography for a long time. Signan y Gonzalez, and they finally are, because it used to be really hard to find information about them. And I'll just conclude by saying that next week is the last week. We have Eric Calderwood coming for the final lecture, and he will discuss his book, On Earth or in Poems, The Many Lives of al-Andalus, which was just published and will 99% sure be available in the gift shop by next week. So you can have your copy signed as well. But that's it for today. Thank you so much.
All right, we do have time for a few questions. So I just ask that you raise your hand so I can bring the microphone should you have a question. Okay, we'll start here.
You may have said this, but I missed it. When did color photography become widespreadly used?
Not till much later. However, I think I have an image. What they would do is color in black and white photographs with different inks and tints. I don't know exactly when color photography became commercialized, but later. It was definitely later.
I'm gonna go to the closest and then I'll come up here.
This isn't a question, it's an observation. I have been to Danielle Garzon's place. Have you?
No, I haven't.
Well, it's still going, and so it's, you should go.
I would love to.
Because he has lots and lots of stuff there.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Coming up to you.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much. I was noticed on the one where they had the women. I wondered about, I was thinking of Eugène Delacroix and his women of Algiers in their apartment. And I don't know the timing, but how much timing were they contemporaries? And what was happening in this sort of colonial North Africa, French domain, and what was the trend also in Spain? How are those overlapping or engaging?
That's a really good question, and it's an important one that Eric Calderwood will definitely address next week. But briefly, Delacroix earlier in the 19th century. I don't know exact dates. I want to say like 1830s. Don't quote me, but the sort of Edward Said Orientalism that we are taught is really dealing with French and British Orientalism in American, where this is completely the other. And then there are authors like Susana Martinez Marquez, whose book Disorientations was highly influential, which really explores this idea of Spanish Orientalism being completely different than that sort of French English brand, because you have this complex history of over 800 years of Muslim rule. You also have a different relationship between Spain and Morocco in the 19th century, especially in the late 19th century, where you even have photographers like Garzón going to Morocco, taking photographs, but they're much different. It's very much like Garzón is seen as a figure who invites tourists in to sort of embrace this Spanish Orientalism within Spain. But then when he goes to Morocco, he really is the sort of outsider, Western colonizer gaze, trying to take images of people who don't want to be photographed. So they're all often taken from a distance and sort of hidden, and they're blurry. And so it's an important question, and it's very complicated. And I think only in the past couple of decades have scholars really gotten into this topic of the differences between what's happening in Spain and what's happening elsewhere. And in fact, Said, in his original Orientalism, which I think is early 70s, didn't differentiate that. And it was in like a second or third edition where he says, okay, the case in Spain is actually much different.
Okay, we have two more questions. I'll come here and then we'll conclude in the front.
It's really interesting to me to see what you've highlighted, and that to me is the impact of technology in cultural shifts. My understanding is that prior to Washington Irving and some of the photography that you pointed out, the idea of a perception of Spain was Black Spain, which was promoted by British for, strategic reasons. That shift occurred during this time, and I'm curious as to how much photography had to do with it. It's almost a parallel as to what we see with the internet these days. And it's really, to me, very interesting. Can you expand on that? Am I assuming that shift from Black Spain to white Spain happened as a result of some of this?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And this idea of the like leyenda negra, I mean, it seeps into the 19th century for sure. And this idea of Spain's sort of unique position in the history of Western Europe, and these comments that I think I alluded to in the first week too, of Spain starts in the Pyrenees, as sort of Spain is part of Africa and is different. You can travel to the Orient, but without leaving Europe. I think this was, as I think we can see in the photographs especially, that this is something that's being both embraced and kind of pushed away by Spanish politicians, authors, photographers who have this complex relationship, but at the same time are benefiting from it, are commercializing this image, and it's part of the market. It's marketable and beneficial to sort of have a position where your identity is fluid, if that makes sense. A little.
Yeah, I guess my thought was more what you described as Black Spain. It doesn't necessarily mean, if you say African Spain, it's more of Spanish culture being portrayed as
The Inquisition, yeah, absolutely. I think it goes hand in hand with that Spain is different. And particularly I'm part of the, Anglo-Americans and British who don't understand this intense Catholicism and see it as just as foreign as Spain's Islamic past. And that's often highlighted, I think, even in images like Murray's image of the Mosque Cathedral, that these are it's a double foreignness. And it's intense Catholicism. I mean, images of Semana Santa are also very popular at this time. And it's Islamic past.
Okay, my question is on this lithograph, on the far right, the man standing with the boots, the circular hat with the little pom-pom on top, is that the sign of the gypsy?
I think it is. I think this is supposed to be an image of Mariano Fernandez. Absolutely.
Yes, and also this is titled Modern Goths.
Yes.
I assume that we would say modern Philistines or something like that.
Something like that, I think.
with
Yeah.
that in mind? And one more question on the painting, the four women of harem. Did you say that's anonymous? I didn't see a painter on that one. The four women. Yeah, right there.
Oh yeah. This is actually on the market. I took this is either on Christie's or Sotheby's website, and it is labeled as Italian Orientalist. So don't know who the artist is.
Oh, they don't know.
Don't know.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, Cristina, thank you so much, not just for this lecture, but you have been instrumental in putting this entire series together. So thank you for all your work today and behind the scenes. So we look forward to seeing you all next Friday when we wrap up with Dr. Eric Calderwood, who is flying in just for this lecture. So see you next week. Thank you.
Thanks.